I went to speech therapy and I really worked through my speech. And we think, that Moses had some kind of speech impediment, and yet God still called him to lead, right? God wasn't like, oh, you're right, I hadn't considered your weaknesses. I will find someone else. He said, no, like, I know with your weaknesses that I was calling you. And he, it really emboldened him to be a leader for God's people. And so for me, I worked on my speech, and it's funny because now I talk a lot, preach a lot, and so God uses not just your strengths but your weaknesses to lead.
The whole world is sick. Are you worried about America? I am.
Believe the impossible and you can do the incredible.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of The Catholic Patriot. And today I am joined by someone who has been very hard to pin down to have a great conversation. And, well, he's with us today. I want to welcome Father David Michael Moses. Kind of curious which one he goes by the most because he's got three cool names. But he joins us from the Houston area. So, Father, you gonna let me know what your preference is? Father Michael, Father Moses.
I know it can be confusing. And my first day at seminary, they were calling roll, and the teacher said, David Michael Moses? Gosh, that's greedy of you. So I guess in some ways, maybe I was always destined for this vocation. But to answer your question, I always grew up going by David Michael, both together.
Okay,
And so
David
now
Michael.
I go by Father David Michael,
Okay.
Michael, or just Father most of the time. So thank you so much for having me today. I've really been looking forward to this.
Well, like I said, it's been a while in the making, and I think that it's that way for everyone now. Everybody's so busy, and if you don't get something one time, it's hard to reschedule. Sometimes things don't even happen. But
Sure.
I think it's, I see everything as providential, and here we are. We're in the month of our Blessed Mother, a day after the anniversary of Fatima, and creeping up on us really fast is this National Eucharistic Congress. But before we even jump into those things, as you may know about with our podcast here, The Catholic Patriot, it's inspired so much by Venerable Fulton Sheen. It's an outreach of the Fulton Sheen movement and the Fulton Sheen Institute. And so one of the first questions I ask, especially if it's like a priest or seminarian, is, has Fulton Sheen had an impact on your life? And I would say, be honest, because sometimes I take for granted, oh yeah, everybody knows a lot about him, but others like, I don't really know much about him. Like when I went to Steubenville in the 90s, I hadn't really even heard of him until after I graduated. So I'm always curious about his impact.
Yeah. Well, thankfully for me, he's had a huge impact in my life. I grew up listening to my dad. He would tell people, he said, you guys don't realize that when I was growing up, and my dad wasn't even Catholic before, him and my mom met and they got married. But when he was younger, he said that there were only so many stations. There wasn't that much going on TV. But for a while, the number one rated show on television was a Catholic bishop teaching theology, and he was like, "Guys, y'all don't recognize how crazy that is. Like, people don't appreciate that enough." That for a while, a Catholic bishop had the most popular show on television. And so my dad would show me clips and videos growing up, and I think very influential to me, especially in terms of my preaching, because I think he did two things really, really well that stuck out to me. Number one, he saw the value of humor He
Hmm.
recognized humor wasn't this just cheap thing to throw away. It was like, no, let's use this to engage. Like, let's humor, telling a good joke is a great way to get a captive audience. And maybe they're just listening because it's funny or they want to know how the joke ends. But then you got them, right? And now they're listening. And then you can hit them with some truth that's going to change their life. And so, and then second thing is he was great at telling stories, right? He was
Hmm.
very good at telling stories. And if you look at Jesus in scripture, so many of his sermons are just him telling stories. There was a son and his father, and the son took out the inheritance and went off, and you kind of just want to know how the story ends, and like Jesus knew, he was fully human. He knew that people would be curious about this, and he used that to convey some really, really deep truth. And so those two things I have really taken to heart, and I still go back and look at his, I'll YouTube on him, YouTube Fulton Sheen on this or whatever, and so I'll take note of the jokes that he's using and bring them back around, and so the humor, I think, and the storytelling have been very, very influential for my priesthood.
It's interesting. I think that's what impacted me the most as well. I came into him when I lived in Texas, and for those who are just joining us, if you don't know where Father David is from, he's just north of Houston. So, what is the town itself, by the way?
It's called Spring,
Spring.
Texas.
Okay. I had a roommate who lived in Kingwood, but I think that's to the west
Yeah,
ish.
just a little bit northwest of us. Yeah, 20
Yeah.
minutes away,
Okay.
probably.
So, um, anyway, Father joins us from Houston, and when I spent a year in Texas back right after I graduated Steubenville, I was discerning the priesthood, like what's God want me to do in my life, and uh, I came across this Fulton Sheen, and for me, I discovered not just an inspiring uh, preacher; it was a priest retreat, seminarian retreat, but I found that he was like the most brilliant theologian that I knew, and it was disguised in many respects because he had such an ability to transmit things in a language that anybody could understand, and yet with a power that by the time this retreat was done, I went on a private retreat. I just knew my whole life was going to change, and I had to make a massive decision. And for me, it was to make a daily holy hour, and that changed my
Mm.
life. So, um, anyway, I just think it's fascinating, and I'm always interested to know about his impact on priests because here we are, this this time of the Eucharistic revival, and the Eucharist is tied inextricably to the priesthood. And I always saw him as the icon of what this Eucharistic revival was like, and also an icon for the Renaissance and the continued revival of the priesthood, especially among the younger priests. And the more who discover him, the more I see just great things happening. So, anyway, I saw a lot of things that were reminiscent as I'm learning. I was beginning to study what you were up to, and lots of surprises. Um, and I think it would be great if you could. I know you have a, a brief video on it on your website, but can you summarize for those who are for the first time hearing of you or watching you, what your journey to the priesthood was like? Because it wasn't a straight
Yeah.
shot. Like, oh, I knew since I was 7.
Right, exactly. No, I think the kind of the condensed version would be grew up in a good Catholic family, loved altar serving, being close. You mentioned the Eucharist. For me, being close to the Eucharist as an altar server was the most important thing I did every week. But I wanted to get married, even from a young age, and I assumed that meant I didn't have to be a priest. I wasn't supposed to be a priest. And so it wasn't until I went on a silent retreat when I was 16 that I really felt the Lord saying in my heart, like, it might be you. It might be you. I'm calling to be a priest. And a little bit scary, kind of crazy. And I remember telling the priest on the retreat, I'm kind of feeling drawn to discern the priesthood, but I really want to get married. There's some pretty girls in the youth group, and I don't know what to do about that. And he said, that's priesthood. That's totally fine. That's normal, but God still might be calling you, and you've got to take that seriously. And so that really kind of put everything back in perspective for me. And I started praying a lot, going to daily mass, praying the rosary, and just really fell in love with how a priest could help people. I mean, I would say like the bottom line for me came down to like, man, giving up a wife and kids is going to be a huge sacrifice. Um, but if giving up that sacrifice, if the sacrifice is what conforms me to Jesus Christ in such a way that I'm able to forgive sins in his person and confession and change bread and wine into his body and blood, then that would be worth giving my life to, you
Hmm.
know, like that would be worth it. And seminary was tough. Every year, the first probably 5 years, I was like 50-50 coming back the next year, but something always happened and I came back the next year. And by that fifth year, it was like, oh no, like this is the only thing I want to do with my life, you know? And I'm 5 years in now, and it has just been an incredible gift. The moments you get to experience as a priest, what you get to do. It's not easy, but it's meaningful, you know, and that's what I
Hmm.
was hoping for. And that's definitely what it is. It is just full of meaning. And it's just been a huge gift.
That's awesome. You know, one of the things that we often forget, and we're reminded by stories like yours and so many lives of saints too, is like, oh, I'm saying no to so many different things, and that's true. Every time you say yes, you are saying no to other things. But God knows what He's doing, and there's things that happen in our lives when we grow up, or even depending on when one becomes a priest, that there's experiences or passions and drives that He simply just redirects into, let's say, in your case, the priesthood. I look at Saint Maximilian, another one of my favorites. He uh, was drawn to the military. Saint Ignatius, and once they went onto the path that God had for them, they didn't lose those things. They became more manifest, but for His kingdom. What things in your life did you probably think or were concerned about that maybe weren't going to translate, but either did or became even more? Because I've seen you now do a thing I never would have believed unless my wife Chantal's like, hey, check this out, because he's done rap. And I'm like, I haven't heard of anybody who does that except for a priest I grew up with, Father Stanford. Too. So anyway, how
Yeah,
does that
Stan the
translate?
man.
I know he's awesome. How was that translated into your life and into your priesthood?
I really appreciate that question because I do think it was close to my heart, but also I think it's a question a lot of young men and women have when God is calling, which is like, oh, does this mean that everything I've done in the past is just like gone? Does this mean everything I feel drawn to is just completely goes away? You know, and I think, I mean, on a base level, there's something very healthy about when the Lord says, come follow me, really being detached from everything and saying, like, Lord, I will follow you no matter what that means. You know, like
Mhm.
unconditionally, I am detached from everything, relationships, family, friends, things, everything. But what's really interesting is that you detach yourself. For me, that was like, you know, I really enjoyed making videos growing up and I really enjoyed playing music. And when I entered seminary, I remember calling the rector of the seminary and saying, hey, I have like video equipment. I've had jobs making videos. Would this be helpful for the seminary or should I just kind of leave this stuff here? And he was like, nah, dude, bring it. Like, we need to make videos here, you know? And so I was like, oh, okay. So started making videos for the seminary. And now I make videos that, you know, a lot of people see. And I use that, you know, for apologetics and evangelization and vocations, you know, with social media. So, you know, and another thing was music. You know, I'd been writing songs since I was a kid, played a few different instruments. And when I entered seminary, I kind of thought like, well, that's the end of that. You know, I'm just going to focus on learning Latin and praying and studying scripture and, you know, did those things. But we started doing this thing we called the Concert for Life, which was just started off as like a small benefit concert for a pregnancy center here. We had about 300 people the first year. And we just kind of kept doing it because there was a need. It seemed like a good thing. I started inviting other priests to come play. And this summer, we've got 6 priests flying in from all the country who are really elite musicians at what they do. And we'll probably have over 2,000 people at the show this summer. And we've
Wow.
raised close to $1 million over the last decade for this pregnancy
Wow.
center to help women in crisis pregnancies. So, you know, I guess all that to say, you know, when you go to follow Jesus, he doesn't want you to stop being who you are because he made you who you are. And he's whatever gifts you have are not
Mhm.
due to you, they're gifts he gave you. And if he gave them to you, he probably wants to use them. He probably gave them to you because he was going to need those for the kingdom at some point. And
Mhm.
so I love what you said. You need to redirect sometimes. And many of the saints have done that. You got to kind of redirect sometimes that energy, that focus. And there's going to be very serious sacrifices along the way. But ultimately, it is about becoming exactly it's becoming more of who you are, not
Mhm.
less of who you are as you get closer to Christ.
I think you nailed it on that last point, because I remember in the life of Fulton Sheen, that was a hard lesson that he learned was before he became a priest. He was in the minor seminary, and he was in the debate club. I don't know if you know the story, but it's the priest who became very dear to him later on, Father Bergen. After the first debate, he pulled Sheen aside and he says, "You are the worst debater I have ever seen, worst speaker." And you can imagine how that mortified him. And you never told him why. And he just let Sheen mull it over and mull it over. And eventually Sheen came banging on his door and he says, I figured it out. I figured it out, Father. He's like, what is it? He's like, I have to be who I am. And, God's going to work with me through that, not trying to be something that I'm not. And, now we know him decades later as this so choreographed, telegraphed personality, but that is Sheen to the core.
Yeah.
And anyway, I think it's beautiful to see that I have a number of friends who have become priests, and God has placed them in the right area. Some are religious, some are like Friars of the Renewal. One's a missionary in China, one's now the vocations director, and just to see how God has used them, and I think that's always a gift. I'm always curious what what was the greatest blessing or surprise after you became a priest, and what was the greatest challenge that you've discovered since being a priest?
Yeah, I think maybe the biggest surprise could be a lot of different things. That actually might be connected. I would say with both of those, the biggest challenge, maybe is the biggest surprise, is there are so many good things to be doing
Mhm.
that it's kind of hard to figure out which good thing you should be doing. Because especially where we are in Houston, my first parish, there were 20,000 people who
Oh,
went
wow.
there. There's a million good things you could be doing, and you, as a priest, I'm prioritizing celebrating mass, hearing confessions, anointing, doing the things that only I can do. um, but you have to be constantly kind of discerning, like, okay, these are all these good things. Sometimes the enemy even uses good things to distract you from the good things you should be doing, and in any vocation. And so I think that's been the biggest challenge. In terms of the biggest surprise, to be honest, is like how much I enjoy it. Like I really enjoy, like, there's difficult moments, but I um enjoy saying mass, and I enjoy prepping homilies, and I enjoy hanging out with the office staff. And I had an emergency anointing today for a lady who was dying, and I enjoyed being able to be with her and her family, in those last moments. And I'm enjoying this right now, and I've got more meetings later. I guess uh, kind of the dynamic rhythm of daily life as a priest is like really it's really beautiful, and I really like that. It's almost surprising to me how much the dynamism just kind of gels with my soul, and I believe I was made for this, so it makes sense be different for different people. But that's been a
Mhm.
very pleasant surprise for me.
What's been your secret in the sense of, right now, as we know, we're living in extraordinary times, and the attack that is taking place right now within the church against marriages and families, very much like exactly what Sister Lucia had said would be coming in our times. Um, and of course, it affects priests. Um, what has been I don't know if secret's the right word, but what have you found that has been the source of that strength? Something, particular that you do?
Yeah.
In addition to
When
the office and the normal things that are expected.
Of course. Well, and the normal things that are expected are expected for good reasons, right?
Right? Absolutely. Pray
That I mean, I,
always.
I love the fact that I promise to pray the office 5 times a day, because it does kind of keep you locked in. The rosary. I was telling somebody this morning, I like the rosary because it structures my day in a lot of ways. I pray a few decades here and a few decades there, and it structures my day. I would say for me, on like a human level that God works through, having good friends, gosh, it's
Hmm.
been such a blessing. I mean, that is not something I deserved, but good priest friends, good lay friends, people from high school I kept in touch with. family, friends, like that has been such a huge support to me because as a priest, you are set aside. Like you've been consecrated. These hands are different now, and you've been set aside, and that's a beautiful gift. But the enemy wants to use it to isolate, and you have to make sure
Mhm.
you stay connected with the community and with the body of Christ, and that you don't get lost in that. That you don't forget it. It's important that you also don't lose yourself. And I'm just like everybody else. That's not helpful.
Mhm.
But I think having good people who call you out on your stuff and are there to talk when you need it has been especially helpful for me. In addition to things like we said, things like prayer, exercise, sleep. I mean, I think all those things are pretty important to make sure you don't go crazy. Um, so, yeah, but we're in it for the long haul. There's a
Mhm.
lot of attacks. I know you get ordained a priest, and there's a target on your back, and the more good you do, the bigger the target gets. And I'm only 5 years in, and I want to do this for 50 more years or 60 more years. So pray for me.
Oh, absolutely. We pray for priests all the time. Like I said, one, we have a love for priests already, and it's always something close to my heart. And I spent a number of years discerning that. A bit surprised that God had me on a different path, but I was always an all or none person, and but He's always left. I knew that what I learned in those experiences, which is why I encourage every single man, especially young men, to, I don't care where you are, what you think you are in life, spend some time, at least a year, and give God the
Mm,
opportunity. It's like mandatory military, basic training. We don't have that in this country, but other countries do. And what you get from that experience, no matter what happens, will only make you a better, stronger man. And if God calls you to be a priest, then well, there you go. You've had that door open. Um, and I think that's a great testament, even what you were talking about, because a lot of people don't, they forget some of the essential things of an integrated Catholic life. Like you kind of mentioned it in passing, but exercising, something like that. I would also say, like, just taking care of ourselves. I've learned over time, maybe it's my influence, or the influence of like Christopher West, theology of the body, and those things. But we're not angels, we're not pure spirits,
yep.
and there's a reason the incarnation took place, and it's because every part of us is good, and the devil
Mm,
gets to us through often the neglect of the lower things, so that we then neglect the higher things. Um,
yep.
I'm interested to know, because you are quite a personality and influencer out in the social media world. My wife is really my social presence out there. She does all of that. Otherwise, I couldn't keep up. But you have kept up. It's a big part of how you impact the culture. How have you found that? I mentioned before, your music, and now you do rap, and you're the only other priest that I've come across who does that, and you have depth to your message, and it's resonating. How do you help young people to discern the the integration of things in pop culture with the gospel, and where we want to end up, through that medium?
Yeah. Well, so when it comes to any kind of media, I always compare it to it's like a bad neighborhood. That a bad neighborhood is not a place I would suggest my family go live. It's not a place that I walk around alone in at night. You want to have a buddy, you want it to be daytime, you want to avoid certain areas of it. And I think in a lot of ways social media is like that. It's like a bad neighborhood. But even though a bad neighborhood is a dangerous place to be, I think a bad neighborhood should still have a Catholic church. I think a bad neighborhood should still have a Catholic priest there. And so I think for us, like we should look at media and look at the broader culture as something to be evangelized, but you want to do it very carefully, and you don't want to be alone there, and you don't want to not have accountability there. And so I tread with a lot of caution there. And for most young people, I would say, the first 30 years of Jesus's life, he was not really engaging that much with the culture. Like for 30 years, he was growing as a man. I mean, he was God, but he still took these 30 years with his with Joseph and with his mother to work through this stuff to get ready for that public ministry. And so I think a lot of times with the culture, we're feeding our 12-year-olds to the wolves by
Mm,
putting them out there, in the school systems and all that stuff. I would say for most young people, to be honest, like get out of the culture. Like I would say like most people, I would say like you don't really need social media probably till you turn 18. I would probably get off of it. I would focus on like what the things Jesus was focusing on for the first 30 years of his life, which is like his relationship with his father, his prayer, the things you were saying, like taking care of yourself, getting a good
mm,
sleep schedule, being physically and emotionally healthy, spiritually healthy, having good friendships, being active. That's what I would say for
mhm,
most people. And if you're gonna go there, be super, super careful. And then later in life, after you've matured, I think that's not a bad time to go back in. And then to strategically, with a plan and intentionally to say, okay, how can we, if you feel called to it, it's like a mission field, right? Like you don't
mhm,
just show up on a plane and go to Russia and say like, I'm going to evangelize. Let's see what happens. Like if you're going to Russia to evangelize, you need to have, or you're going to China to
mhm,
evangelize, you need to have a game plan. You need to know what you're getting into.
mhm,
And for me, like I said, it's like a bad neighborhood, but I think there should be some priests there, which is why I'm there. But I have somebody who runs all my accounts, somebody who checks the messages for me, and that kind of thing. So I try to have a little bit of distance from it. I think it's kind of awesome that your wife is your connection to it because you get the good stuff, but you don't have to deal with all the bad stuff. I
yeah,
think that's a great move on your part, and you don't have to keep up with it. So um, that's what I would say is once for a young person, I know most people won't leave social media. I get that, which is why I try to evangelize there. But I think for most people, some distance is probably good. And focus on this and focus on your friends and your family. And then later, if you feel called, you can go back into culture and try to engage with it.
mm, that's good stuff. Yeah, it's difficult. I have a bunch of kids, and the exposure that they have to all these things, and yes, I could definitely be perhaps a stricter gatekeeper for sure, and that's my responsibility. Um, but what they are exposed to, even outside of what I can control, it's important that they have the right understanding of it. And I have found that by doing that, rather than kind of being almost prudish about everything, educating them, that's the reality. Everyone around there is going to be talking about it, but you don't have to necessarily be in it. And if you
Sure.
are, well, they don't get social accounts. That's one thing for sure. But if they are exposed to certain things, and even like YouTube, my son likes soccer. He's really obsessed with it. So is my older daughter, and but it's everything in moderation. And even if you're doing good things, I love keeping up with events in the world, news, all those kinds of things, um, and signs of the times. But I can look back and like, oh my gosh, I just spent 2 hours doing that, and then like one
Sure,
link leads
sure.
to another, and with all the algorithms, your suggestion
Oh, yeah.
things to look at. I'm like, oh my gosh, that looks. I got to check that out. Anyway, it's amazing how things that can be good in themselves can be used. I remember Scott Hahn once saying, he said, you always have to be careful of never settling for the good or just being caught up in that. Because once you do that, you surrender what's best for you, and you make the good the enemy of the best. And I was like, yeah.
That's good.
So even when you're involved, like you were saying in the beginning, gosh, like how do you choose the right things to do? There's so many good things to do.
Right.
Um, Well, anyway, speaking of good things, you mentioned earlier on the Pilgrim Rosary, or I think it officially goes by the Pilgrim Rosary Project. When I came across that, I was very intrigued what that meant, because then it said is a tracker, and my instincts like, oh my gosh, it's the last thing I want is to be tracked.
Well,
And
I'm
yet
praying the
here I have with
rosary.
my iPhone, my Mac, I'm like totally in the grid. Um, but then I started reading, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's absolutely brilliant. Rather than me spill the beans on that, tell us what that's about, because I think it's a great idea.
It means a lot. Yes, essentially, I was doing this long confession time one day, and there were some young ladies who were kind of managing the line, and they just bought a bunch of these rosaries, and they would pray a rosary themselves on it, and then they would give the rosary to the penitents and say, "I just prayed with this. You can pray with this." And I just mentioned that to a buddy of mine who's a priest. I thought that was kind of cool, and he was like, "Man, it'd be kind of cool to keep that going. Like if they prayed on it and they passed it on, that'd be kind of cool." And I was like, "Yeah, what if we put a QR medal on the rosary? Then people could scan it with their phones, and they could log on a big map where they prayed the rosary and who they are, and they could pass it on to somebody, and they could literally see like where their rosary travels in the world, where it ends up, who all prays on it. And if they get one of these rosaries, they can scan it and like see where it came from. Like, that would just be a cool way of spreading Marian devotion and calling, like literally personally inviting other people into a devotion to the rosary. And so it was just like a thought I had. And doctor, within like maybe 6 or 7 months, God had just pulled together conversations, just random conversations with software developers and rosary manufacturers. And then the kicker was my dad's company. They tag leaks in refineries to be fixed. And they use like QR medals. And so he just called that company, was like, "Could I get a bunch of these medals for like some rosaries?" And they were like, "Yeah, for sure." And so God just brought everything together. And it's been about, I think about a year now, a little over a year. And we have about 8,000 of them all over the world, 6 different continents, well over 30 countries. And it's just been a cool way of spreading Marian devotion. And yeah, we were careful. The rosaries themselves are not like, they don't have GPS trackers or anything.
Right, that was my
But if
first
people
thought. I was like,
choose,
"Oh my gosh,
of
they're
course,
chipped
of
or something
course.
like that." But the QR is
I know, like,
brilliant. It's
yeah, and
absolutely
so people can
brilliant.
just register it. It doesn't show their house, it just shows the city they were in. So it's not
Yeah.
like somebody would be able to go find them or something like that. But it's been a real gift for me to kind of just see where it's gone.
I mean, I not to hijack something, but I'm thinking like I love that idea because we have a Fulton Sheen Rosary that we use. He designed it. It's called the World Mission Rosary, and
Oh, beautiful.
it's the evangelization of all the 5 major regions of the world by the colors. So you have like
Oh,
um,
wow.
yeah, yellow for Asia, red for the Americas, the blood of the martyrs, white for Europe for the Pope, blue Oceania, green Africa. And we have, an online prayer group internationally every weekday morning. But it would be awesome to have something that's like you have. It's tangible and it goes around and it just unites people. And hate to say, but put a little pressure on somebody. Can you imagine if like, you're the last one and it just drops off the map and the last location is like Sandpoint, Idaho? People are like, I know who was there.
Well, you know what? That's kind of the idea, is it's a personal invitation, and it's like somebody's counting on you to pray this. And before, if you just said like, "You should pray the rosary," it's like, okay, that's easy to not do. But if you're
Yeah.
like, I'm waiting for this to pop up on the map that you check the box that you prayed it, I think there's something healthy about that.
Yeah, it's like the hot potato rosary. You say it, pass
Uh-huh.
it. Don't
Yep,
don't get caught
exactly.
with it because it's meant to keep moving.
Exactly, because everybody has a million rosaries anyways. This is one that you buy to give away, and then all the proceeds go to the Pregnancy Help Center. So it all goes to help women in crisis pregnancies.
That's amazing. Well, I hope that everyone who's watching this will take advantage of that invitation because I think it's a brilliant idea. Well, speaking of the rosary and going around the world, I'm interested to get your perspective as somebody who's out there on the front lines in the culture. Um, and in the spirit of Fulton Sheen, he always says, look, we can't look at the world as a journalist. Everyone needs to look at the world as a theologian. So we understand not just what happens, but why things are happening and what really matters. What is going through um, your vision of the world right now, and the signs of our own times? Where do you perceive us going? Um, and what encouragement can you give people to embrace the challenges that our era is offering and to do so without fear?
Yeah.
It's a loaded
Well,
question, I know.
sure, of course, but loaded questions are the most fun, right? Um, during COVID, I got ordained, and then COVID hit like 6 months later. Everything was shut down. And I had so many people tell me like, gosh, Father, I'm so sorry. This is like your first year of priesthood, you know? And I always told them, I appreciate that, but honestly, like, this is why I became a priest, because this
Mhm.
whole thing is a mess. And the
Yeah.
world was a mess before COVID, and it was a mess during COVID, a particularly large mess, and it's still a mess now.
Yeah.
That's the world Jesus came into, and that's the world that he left, and that's the world he'll come back to. Like, it's a mess. This is so for people who are asking, like, oh, is this, it's popular to kind of ask, like, oh, is this the end times or whatever? It's like, it's always the end times, right? This is always very broken, and the urgency is always very, very high. And but the call is always the same, which is like, we have to be holy, like we have to be
Mm.
saints, like each one of us has to follow Christ completely and radically to the end. And so I'm really thankful that for me as a priest, um, we talked about social media. I am trying to find ways to connect and engage. And so maybe the hook, we're supposed to be fishers of men. The hook
Mhm.
maybe changes. The bait that we're using in each culture maybe changes. Right now, some of the bait is social media, some of the hook, some of the thumbnail, the way you're trying to bring somebody in might change, but like the
Mhm.
actual work to do is the same. Like the gospel's the same, which is like we need to be making disciples. And for me, that looks like preaching the truth and hearing a boatload of confessions, giving out a boatload of Eucharist at masses, really trying to sanctify the people. John Biani did it a certain way, and he's the patron saint of parish priests. That's the way to do it, and we keep doing that. And so I like what you said, that a big part of what we're trying to do here is like, don't lose hope. Like when you lose hope, like that's when the enemy wins. And there are so many reasons to be hopeful. Um, and I even tell you a quick little story. There's
Absolutely.
5 of us priests who go to all the guys are about my age, the priests, and we go to IHOP once a month at 6 a.m. on a Monday. It's the only time our schedules kind of match up, and we catch up over the last month and everything. And the first time we went, a lady, the waitress, we were asking her, can we get the check? And she said, actually, somebody already paid. Then somebody else offered to pay. Then somebody else offered to pay. She said, I had 5 people offer to pay for you guys. I've never seen this before. So naturally, we always go back to that IHOP at that time. No, I'm just kidding.
I would.
But it was a yeah, always back there. And but it was a moment for me where I was like, wow, like it was 6 a.m. at an IHOP. There weren't more than 5 other people there. It must have been everybody in the IHOP offered to pay,
Mm.
which is not completely uncommon, but to that extreme, that's pretty unique. That was 5 people. And all I could think, doctor, was like that they must have seen some hope at a table of 5 young priests, and they must have
Yeah.
wanted to, be a part of it in some way. They wanted to
Hmm.
contribute something to that. And I think that was kind of emboldening for me, that to say like, yeah, I do want to be a sign of hope, and I want every Christian to be a sign of hope, so that when people see us as Christians, that they're given a little bit of hope, and that they want to be a part of it in some way. They want to contribute something. So I see so much good right now in the church, and would just be right there with you to echo that, to say like, don't lose hope. Cling to the gospel that is unchanging. Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we're going to win this thing in the end. We know how this ends. We just really need to stay faithful.
Mm. Great advice. Yeah. I always remind people, because sometimes people understood rightly, that's the truth. Some people use that as a way of not to do anything. Well, we know who wins in the end of the battle.
Sure.
And I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of casualties of war though. And not
Well,
all
I would
stories end the
say,
same. Remember, Judas was among the 12, so you better stay close to our Lord, make your holy hour. Um, no, but I
well
think
said. I
that's
mean, we know who wins, but you want to make sure you're on the winning side.
yeah, and it's exactly, people say, well, God already knows, but you don't know. So that's why you work out your
Amen.
salvation with fear and trembling, because
Yep.
never presume. But
Well said.
I think that that's all excellent advice, and I think your joy is very contagious in what you do. Your wit, your humor, those are the things that resonate with people today. Um, Oh man, time's flying. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of bottleneck ourselves into as we get to the end is we are coming up to the National Eucharistic Congress. And first off, are you going to be there?
Yeah, we're taking a little group from the parish, so I'm excited to be out there. Are you going?
Fantastic. I think so.
You
We
should.
worked
It
really
should be
hard.
huge.
Well, we worked really hard to try to get Fulton Sheen there present in an explicit way,
Oh,
like a breakout or whatever. But unfortunately, there was no room at the inn. So
mm,
anyway, but I'm sure he'll work his way out in other ways there. And I think that my wife, we're going to try to bring our family out. It's a little bit of a hike from here, but it's an important event. I'd like my kids to experience it. I have friends who are speaking there, and I think it'll be a great experience. And we're hoping to have some Fulton Sheen events kind of around it. One in maybe a few in the Chicago area, and then trying to work our way down to Indianapolis. Um, what can you? Well, let's see. What would you like to leave our viewers with about the significance of this National Eucharistic Congress? How they should be, you know, looking at it versus, oh my gosh, like it's like another cool thing is, not like I'm downplaying things, but sometimes events can be like the events themselves, and you want to like, but this is a very serious thing. 1 in 3 Catholics, 33, it was a 30% of Catholics only that 30% believe in Jesus present in the Eucharist in America, and even fewer are going to Mass every Sunday. Now they say, but that doesn't apply to me, but we are in a existential crisis is the right word, but spiritually speaking, that's an enormous crisis since it's the source and summit of our faith. What thoughts do you have about the significance of this Congress and in the midst of all that's going on?
yeah. Well, one thing I appreciate is that the language of the Congress, they talk about people making a pilgrimage there, which I like that. It's not a
Hmm.
vacation. It's not even just a conference. This is a pilgrimage, and a pilgrimage is about a journey of faith that is going to change me, right? It's a journey of faith that's going to change me in some way. Not necessarily somebody else. I'm the one making the journey. It needs to transform me. So I think whether people are going to the Congress or not, it's good to be thinking in those terms. Like, am I on a journey that is changing me right now? Because if I'm on a journey
Hmm.
that is changing me, I'm going the wrong direction. So
Yeah.
I also think too, I mean, just from we talk about hope. I mean, I think they're saying like 80,000 people are going to come to this thing.
Wow.
And, I'm in an
That's
area, yeah, I think they were shooting for 60,000, but I just heard
that's a
recently
last
somebody,
minute rush.
I think it's what it sounds like, yeah.
Wow.
I might have heard that wrong, but, it's a boatload of people, and I'm in a place where the churches are really, really full, but I would say, like, it's gotta be encouraging to people all over the nation. If you're in a place that the church maybe isn't that full, to be like, "You're not alone, though." Like, you are not
Hmm.
alone as an American Catholic. There's a lot of other people who are in this with you. So be emboldened in that. And then I would say too, if people say like, well, I'm part of the 30%. I'm not part of the 70%. I would say, well, if the 30% were really living it though, I don't know
Hmm.
if we'd have 70%. Like the
Hmm.
70% are able to keep believing that, even if it's an ignorance, right? I think a lot of this
Hmm.
is frankly the clergy not preaching about this and living this over the last 30 years, 50 years, 40. But I would say like if the 30%, priests included, bishops included, lay people included, if we were saying mass and we were receiving the Eucharist and we were doing the consecration in such a way that it was teaching the other 70%, I think those percentages would change very, very quickly. So
Hmm.
that's my, that would be kind of my thought for the individual. And I'm preaching to myself too. How I say mass says a lot to the people about what I believe is going on.
Hmm.
And it's going to be constantly forming hearts. As a father, as a mother, the way you receive communion is teaching your kids exactly what you believe. So
Hmm.
that would be kind of probably my reflection on the spot.
Wow. It's a great one. Quick answer to this one, big question, but What does the Eucharistic revival mean to you? And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Like, for example, if somebody asked me, I emphasize probably more than ever the importance of a daily Eucharistic Holy Hour, like Fulton Sheen did, and why he did it, and that's sort of one of the big crusades that I felt has been entrusted to me to communicate. What's yours?
I would say for me, and I love the Eucharistic adoration is transformative. We've seen that for families, for vocations. I mean, that holy hour to be before the actual Lord in His real presence is changing. For me, I would say a big part of it is it's a resetting of the hierarchy of importance in your life.
Mm,
That if the Eucharist, I mean, if we're going to a bunch of baseball games on Sunday for the kids select team instead of going to mass, it says a lot about what we find important. But
mm,
if we're telling the coach, like, no, like, we've got to take Jimmy to mass, like, I don't care if he's an amazing baseball player and he wants to go pro, coach, like, we're Catholics, we need to go to mass at some point. Man, if we're resetting that hierarchy, family by family, person by person, I mean, that changes a culture. And I think part of the reason why that belief is those statistics are so important is because they point to what's being valued. Because if Sunday Mass really is just a collection of people getting together to sing some songs and listen to a nice little homily reflection, then why not miss that? But if the Mass really is like being present with Christ at Calvary as He lays down His life for your sins and then gives you His flesh to eat, then yeah, we can miss a baseball game, you know? Um, so I think that's what it is for me, is like, let's reset the priorities. And the 10 commandments, keep the Sabbath holy, is God saying, like, you do best as my creatures when you keep your priorities in
right.
check. And when you get your priorities upside down, you guys are going to destroy yourselves, which is what we're
Mm,
seeing in the culture. So that would be what I would say, is like, it's
mm.
about resetting hierarchy. In your life.
That's
And the daily
that's a
holy hour is exactly that, right? Like, every day, am I prioritizing that or not?
right, right. Everything feeds, and it's interesting. We just had an experience of that yesterday or Sunday. Um, my son, I guess I mentioned he's a big soccer fan. He's involved in their like travel ball, as we used to call it when I grew up in New Jersey. It was kind of, and it's the kind of
Awesome.
the higher level for him. But he has all of his tournaments are on the weekend, and we were in Canada the weekend before, and the first thing was, "Where's mass? What time is it?" Better hope it doesn't conflict with your schedule, because we were in the middle of nowhere,
Yep.
Canada, Nelson, British Columbia. There's nothing other than one parish. The closest other one was like 2 hours away.
Wow.
I had to talk to my son about that. And I was edified because he's like, I understand, Pa, I understand. We went to confession. It was first Saturday too. We actually found confession. But, and then this Mother's Day, he missed his final game, not because of mass, but it was a question of priority. It wasn't the final, I should say. They had a consolation game, which I said, look, if you guys make that, we're not going because it's Mother's Day.
Hmm.
And the team was like, we need him really, like, without him, we don't have any subs. Um, and I was like, no, he can't miss this. He's not going to miss his Mother's Day one. The game doesn't, I mean, it's a consolation game. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
secondly, I'm just like, no, it's like, no, this is more important. And it speaks to everyone, that, I mean,
Yeah.
they end up getting crushed 8-1. So I was like, Becca, you're strong. Your presence is strong, but I don't think it would have filled that gap. Anyway, but it's there's that question is always there in the culture, especially the sports culture. I think you were really dead on about that. um and yeah, it's first things first. It's simplifying. I love that. You mentioned 10 commandments, and of course my mind went to Moses, and this will be my final question to you. I'd love to go on forever, to be honest. But very, very interesting. David Michael Moses, have you stopped and thought about the significance of that name, as for you in these particular times that we live in the church and in the world. And we are at the end of an era. Fulton Sheen was very strong about that. John Paul II was, very clear. He says we're living in the final confrontation. This is it. Like, we're at the end, and things are like the Latin saying, remember our Latin from those days, motus in fine velocior, things, they quicken at the end, and we're in that quickening right now, like a quarter going really, really wobbly before it crashes. We're just seeing all these elements. And yet, Fulton Sheen, his name meant war and peace in Irish and Gaelic. Fulton, war; Sheen, peace. And his real name was Peter. And anyway, I've always fascinated by names, but your name really stood out, like Moses. The Exodus and leading God's people at a critical moment. I'm just curious if you have. You don't have to get into the details, but I'm kind of curious if you thought about that.
That's a fantastic question. Never really gotten that. One, I have thought about it a little bit, and I think everybody should think about their name. Names have meanings. Names have authority, and it does say a lot about maybe what God is doing in your life. Yeah, for me, I actually had a relatively serious speech impediment growing up. And when I entered seminary, I did my psychological evaluation, and the psychologist was like kind of concerned about him preaching one day because it's kind of hard to understand him. And you mentioned Fulton Sheen earlier in debate class, and so I went to speech therapy, and I really worked through my speech. And we think that Moses had some kind of speech impediment, and yet God still called him to lead. Right? God wasn't like, "Oh, you're right. I hadn't considered your weaknesses. I will find someone else." He said, "No, like, I know with your weaknesses that I was calling you," and he, it really emboldened him to be a leader for God's people. And so for me, I worked on my speech, and it's funny because now I talk a lot, preach a lot, and so God uses not just your strengths but your weaknesses to lead. And definitely as a priest, I'm conformed to Christ, and I definitely need to be a leader. So I've thought a little bit about it, and hopefully I can, live the name my parents gave me well.
Well, and I just in my very brief thinking about, I was like, and then now in light of your story, David, and I've spoken about this a number of times with people, and a priest friend was the one who really inspired me about it. He's like, I asked him about, what do we do? We're up against such power and such evil. The Sheen talked about that. He says the demonic is loose now more than ever. And we're up against so much of that power, and we don't really see much, you can say, goodness winning on the big scheme. Just look at the 30% that you mentioned. And he says, look, he's like, Peter, he's like, we don't need Goliaths to fight against Goliaths. We need Davids. We need Davids against God. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. And then we're living in a time right now too where there's it's a big increase in the devotion to Saint Michael. There was this huge, probably saw it. There's that huge kind of a documentary movie that was put on it, and yet it's also a battle at masses. Do we say it after mass? Do we not? Well, what do the bishops want, or what are they telling people? And people are like, well, we still need to say it. But Saint Michael's in the heart of this thing, and then of course Moses, and we are at a moment of rapid change that is underway right now. I always remind people, like, America will never go back to the way it was. It will never be the same. And like Fulton Sheen said very explicitly, he's like, and we don't want it to be, because it was precisely what was bad in it that led to our demise now. And the Catholic world has not risen to claim it like it has, should have been. Kind of like what Sheen did almost single-handedly. And then Mother Angelica, you could say, took it, ran with that. Our country's never, unlike Europe, we've never been a Catholic country. We've never even been a quite explicit country by our own constitutions and things, even though we've had all the principles. But now there's something happening, and what's coming, we have to go through what we're going through, but what's coming is something that I think many mystics have, I know many mystics have talked about. The great glory of the church, like it has never seen, is coming, and that we have to get through this passion. So I know this is a little bit of a parentheses on just your name, but it's so unique. I've never known another Moses. It would be great if you had your brother was Aaron,
That would
I
be
mean,
convenient,
maybe,
yes.
but anyway, I just thought about that, and as we come to the conclusion, before two things before we go, where can people go to follow what you're doing, learn about the Pilgrim Rosary, and anything that's coming up? That's your event, the concert. What was it called again? The life
Yeah,
concert
the
for
Cons
life.
for Life.
Yep.
Cons for Life. Yeah, that's August 9th in Houston. We also just added a Dallas date, so that's August 7th, I believe. And we're looking at doing something in Austin at some point too. People in the area, they can come check that out. Or honestly, that concert is so fun. It's 6 priests playing a show. It's worth flying in for or driving for to Houston that week if people are up for it. And they can find all the information just fatherdavidmichael.com. They can find me on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, all the standard stuff. And then for the rosary, just pilgrimrosary.com if they want to pick one up. We're out of stock right now, but we're getting a new supply coming in so they can pre-order one. So thanks for giving me a chance to shout out that stuff.
What's your biggest presence? Is it Instagram?
Instagram, probably. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so check them out on Instagram. That's where our largest presence is as well. Final word to you, Father, for our listeners.
Yeah, I would just say keep the faith, stay strong no matter what comes. We're headed in the right direction, but you want to make sure, like you said, make sure we're on the winning side of this at the end of it. So, and please pray for me, and I'll be praying for everybody who listens to this.
So you certainly have our prayers, Father. It's been a joy to literally, have this conversation and meet you at the same time. And I'm inspired by a lot of what you said. I'm sure much of our listenership is saying the same thing. And we certainly wish you the best. And if anybody's heading down to the Houston area, what's your parish?
Christ the Good Shepherd is what it's
Christ
called.
the Good Shepherd
So,
in
yeah,
Spring, Texas.
that's right. We would love to see them down here. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing. This is absolutely amazing. And I appreciate you having me on. This has been a blast.
Oh, yeah. Well, pleasure's all mine. And well, in any way that we can always serve what you're doing and work together, to reach more people, that's what we're all about. I mean, Sheen reached 30 million people a week. This is, pre-internet,
Wild.
pre all that stuff. And
Yeah, that's wild.
that's just nuts. And here we are coming up on Pentecost Sunday after so many extraordinary things happening. So by the time others are watching this, I hope that they're experiencing those graces and asking for those graces, because like Father said, we have to be saints and not just some kind of, colloquial saying, or it's real. Even Father Hardin at one point said only heroic Catholic families will survive what was coming. And he said that in the late 70s. So here we are, and we need to be, I love military things, but like a band of brothers. You have your group of priests. Find a solid group of strong friends that have what you want to be. The secular world gets that really well. Entrepreneurs always talk about that. Show me your 3 closest friends. I'll tell you what kind of person you are. I'll tell you if you're rich or whether you're poor before you even answer the question, because you are pretty much like who you surround yourself by. It doesn't mean that you go out and you reach out, you have outreaches too and those kinds of things, or you have some extensions, of course, but your core, you need that kind of fraternity or sorority, or and especially family in these times, and the devil wants to keep that away. So thank you, Father, for all of that wisdom, and be assured of our prayers. And I hope that's in the future, when there's another downtime, if that's ever possible, we'd love to have you back on and see what the latest is.
Sounds great. I'll look forward to it.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for another episode of The Catholic Patriot. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Right is right if nobody is right. Wrong is wrong if everybody is wrong. And believe me, in this error-infested world, what we really need is a church and an authority that is right not when the world is right, but one that is right when the world is wrong.
Never in history has the prayer of the Rosary been more needed to save our families, our countries, and defeat the evils of the world than now. The Fulton Sheen Institute worked closely with Aroma Rosary to develop the most unique, beautiful, and meaningful rosary that was inspired by Fulton Sheen's World Mission Rosary. This special handcrafted rosary continues Sheen's passion to support the mission of the Church to evangelize the entire world. Each decade of the rosary has a different color, which corresponds with a different continent. Yellow for Asia, red for the Americas, white for Europe, blue for the nations of Oceania, and green for Africa. Each Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary comes with a set of 4 pure essential oil blends that have been chosen for their therapeutic and theological significance. These blends correspond to the 4 mysteries of the Rosary. Simply choose the oil for the mystery of the day, drop a small drop in the palm of your hand, and massage the oil over the surface, being sure to catch the lava beads. You're good to go, and your prayer will linger longer with these beautiful aromatic notes. Every Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary you purchase supports our mission to fight the battle for the hearts and souls of the Christian family and lead our world back to God. So visit the Fulton Sheen Institute's store and pick up your beautiful Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary today. Get one for you, your family members, and your close friends, and don't forget your pastor. Thank you so much for your prayers and your support.